Thank you very much. I've been introduced as, my name is Samson Ondiek. I work with a public utility company, Kenya Power. It's one of the largest utility companies in East and Central Africa. And I'm going to give a short presentation on what we've been discussing on from a practical perspective. I've been involved in the implementation of energy access strategies and policies in Kenya. So to start us with, all of us have looked into what is happening in Africa. That is a night photo of Africa, how it looks like. And from the photo, you can see there's a bit of electrification activities within the Southern Africa, the Western Africa, and then the northern side of the Africa. But the majority of the Sub-Saharan Africa, it's still in the dark. People have rightly put it like about 650, between 600 and 650 million people within that particular region still don't have access to electricity. Of course, majority of the same people live within the rural areas. And our focus, of course, is guided by the UN, SDG 7, that is looking at having universal access by the year 2030. This was reinforced by the Africa Union Agenda 2063, that committed all the African nations to try and have electricity access to their citizenry by the year 2030. Okay? Of course, this is aimed at relieving, or the twin objective is to reduce the level of poverty within these particular nations and, of course, improve the well-being of the nations. So over the last 10 years, a lot has happened after the commitment of the African nations in terms of increasing access level within the African countries. In 2009, access level within the Sub-Saharan region was in the ranges of about 31%. To date, that has increased to about 43%. This is because of the government, most of the government's commitment, and of course, development partner support, most probably the World Bank, the IFC, the African Development Bank, and other bilateral support from the West. The support was in two fronts. One, into supporting the increase from the downstream, because you cannot achieve universal access without supporting the generation part of the infrastructure, and then, of course, the distribution part of the infrastructure. So a lot has gone to support the two. And for example, in Kenya, a lot of investment moved into geothermal generation. Kenya has a potential of about 10,000 megawatts in geothermal. Over the last 5 years, about 700 megawatts of geothermal has been added to the grid. Our grid is not so big, so 700 really is something we could be proud of. Our total installed capacity at the moment is about 2,900 megawatts. So if you have 700 megawatts on geothermal, that is something big. We also have Ethiopia, that is bringing on board about 1,000 megawatts in geothermal. Kenya has added another 50 megawatts in solar. Okay, that is grid-tied solar. So Egypt is looking into adding about 700 megawatts in grid-tied solar. We have Uganda, Tanzania, Sudan. Most of the Eastern African countries are looking at increasing generation with the support of our development partners. And they're looking at renewable energy as a main source of generation expansion. In addition to that, there's a lot of projects going into wind. Kenya did the first, I think it's the largest in Africa, wind farm of about 300 megawatts that is already operational. And I'm going to talk later about some of the challenges that we've already started encountering with this expansion of renewable energy into very small grid systems. With a 300 megawatts installation within a grid system of about peak demand of 1,800, that can create a problem, especially during off-peak areas when our demand drops down to about 1,000. So the system is running on total renewable energy during off-peak. That means for example, our base load is on geothermal. Geothermal is about 800 megawatts. So if geothermal is running and then you add 300 megawatts and your peak drops to about 1,000, then you have a problem. because now you're either supposed to curtail the wind or you curtail the geothermal. If you curtail the geothermal, then it doesn't become a base load anymore because it becomes expensive. And then, of course, it beats the logic of expansion in terms of the renewable energy. So there's a lot that we are experiencing with this drive of increasing of renewable energy in terms of generation growth. Just to give you an idea of how green our energy mix looks like in Kenya, we have about 44% of our generation dispatched from geothermal, then 29% or 30% is from hydro. We have wind, which is giving us 14%, but we are still maintaining a small level of thermal that is being within the ranges of about 11 and 10%. So we would say we're really moving towards achieving our target of having our energy mix to be totally green. But remember what I've said, moving to that particular target is bringing about new challenges that we really didn't take into consideration as we moved in that particular direction. And of course, that is one of the areas that we've been trying to improve the generation part of the connectivity or increasing of energy access. Then the distribution aspect, we have been having a lot of challenges, especially in Kenya and in other African nations, in terms of, in as much as that grid is close to the citizenry, the connection rate was still a bit low. So what the governments have done is to come up with measures that can be able to address the twin challenge or the challenges related to connections and the tariff. Because in as much as you can connect people and the tariff is still high, what we've realized is that at the end of the day, you will not have people use that energy. It will stay idle. So in summary, if focusing now on Kenya, this is a map of Kenya. The green areas are the areas where electrification levels are very high. This upper part of Kenya is semi-arid, and we have less of grid electricity there, but we have mini grids. And we have grids that are supplied from diesel stations, just to support the administrative centers across that particular area. The temperatures there are very hot, so of course we are looking at ways and means of having renewable energy, especially solar, to support that particular area. The wind farm that I'm talking about, the 300 megawatt wind, is found within this particular area. So the power is coming from here up to Nairobi to support the central grid. Okay. 10 years ago, our connectivity level as a country was about 31%. Today, we are looking at about 70%. So you can imagine over the last few years, a number of measures have been put in place to try and improve our energy access. The government's target is very ambitious, to have everybody connected by the year 2022, way before the African Union target of the year 2030. So I could imagine Africa looking at Kenya as a success story. But this story has its own challenges in terms of what then you can achieve 100% connectivity, but as we're going to see later on, there are some challenges that are starting to come up in terms of the approaches that the government are using. Two main ways that the government has tried to achieve the increased or accelerated connectivity. One, we partnered with the World Bank and the government to do projects we call the Global Partnership on Output-Based Aid, focusing on the informal settlements. In major cities of Africa, the peri-urban areas and the main cities have informal settlements. And most of these informal settlements were not connected to any form of electricity. So the government and the World Bank partnered together and have about 1 million households connected through this particular project, people living within the informal settlements. And then again, that was expanded by the African Development Bank and the World Bank, again, the European Union, the French government, to connect additional 3 million people living within the rural area by the expansion of the grid network. And that is where our problem started. Because we brought on board 4 million new customers, more than double what we initially had in terms of connectivity, and all of that was done through grid expansion. Okay? As you can see, our total consumption as a utility increased, cumulatively increased, but the per capita consumption dropped. Okay? This is the access level. Access level shot from the year 2013 when we had a new government, and the government commitment with the development partners had a very, very accelerated. In fact, the first year of the government, we connected an additional 1 million new customers. That had never been had. Our average over years was about 50,000. Moving from 50,000 to 1 million in 1 year was a tall order. You can imagine the massive investment that has gone into that. But that created a problem. As a utility, we expected to reap big, because now you have increased demand, you have increased number of customers, but our per capita consumption dropped. And that is where we started wondering, what is the problem? We did a study to look at the kind of consumption that these particular new customers we are bringing on board are giving us. And what we found out is that, as you can see from this map, the red part is the median consumption of these new customers that have been connected over the 4 million new customers that I'm talking about that have been collected over the last 5 years. This is, the dark one is also the median of the older customers who existed in the system and how their consumption pattern have grown over a period of time. Okay? This is the months from 0 to 120 months after connection. So if you can see from this graph, the new customers, the one that we've just connected recently, their growth in consumption rate is very, very low. Remember, we were targeting the informal customers and the last mile customers living in the rural areas. So the growth of the consumption, it was extremely lower compared to the average urban, a bit middle class kind of customers. Of course, again, what we've realized is that they peak very fast. They reach their peak very fast compared to the other older customer, meaning the power for them is for the mere basic consumption activities. So after you have your lighting, after you have your TV, that's it. You are not looking at an increased consumption. And that was worrying because as a utility, we are supposed to make profit at the end of the day. And you can't make profit with this kind of customers. First of all, you have a subsidized connection. Secondly, you have issues related to tariff, which is pro-poor. So the tariff that these particular customers enjoy is below our generation cost. So first of all, you're paying in terms, because it is a subsidized tariff, you're paying in terms of that missed opportunity to sell, and then again, their consumption is very low. Okay? So that became our worrying point. This is an example of the customers that we are connecting. One of the issues that was quite challenging with regards to connecting these customers was the issue of internal wiring. You must have in Africa, when a house is constructed, it is upon the owner of the house to make sure that the wiring is ready for the grid to be connected. That was a challenge because it's quite expensive. So for us to go to take care of that challenge, we introduced what we call a ready board for these informal settlements and homes that are not able to, cannot afford to get connected. This is just a board with one socket, a lamp, and then the meter is installed there. It's a prepaid meter, so it's easier for us to be able to manage that. So we introduced this at a cost of about $10. It is pretty cheap, and the connection was being subsidized by the government, so it was easier for everybody to get connected. This is within the refugee areas. So these are people who are not going to be there for long, but it's still important for them to enjoy energy, because if you don't give them electricity, they'll use the same of carbon, like the kerosene, and they'll use firewood, for heating and everything else. So those are typically kind of customers we are talking about. One interesting thing that also we found out is that 14% of the customers that we connected never used our power. Can you imagine? After that massive investment, 14% of the people that we connected actually didn't use our power 6 months down the line. Why? This was our problem. We assumed we wanted to make everybody equal. Everybody was being given the same treatment, wherever they were. So if in the rural areas you're given the same kind of power that somebody in the urban areas were getting. So that brings the question, should we really focus on equality or should we look at equity? Should everybody get some bit of access or should everybody get the same level of access? And then again, the other thing is, should poverty alleviation precede connections? It's something that we really need to think through if you need to support this, because there's no point of putting a lot of emphasis on access yet nobody uses those particular power. So to enable us go beyond this, and because so many people are looking at Kenya as an example in the near future in terms of electrification, we as a nation looked at our strategy for electrification, and we say the best way to go about it is to try and match customer demand with the available option for electrification. So we categorized the customers into three. We looked at the scattered rural households. We looked at the households under grid, people who can easily get connected within the grid, and their capacities for consumption. For customers who are very far off, let's not even think about mini grids. The best solution for them is pay-as-you-go. We've seen that work very well with the private sector, involvement in terms of M-Corpus and those kinds of system where you give somebody gets a very small system that is equal to their demand, which is it's not expensive. They can easily manage them and then run with them. And then the mini grids can be used where we have an anchor customer, so that then it can support the entire system. And then, of course, the grid can work through. My time is up, so I just want to summarize and say that with this particular finding, it became very paramount that government should review their regulations and especially policy governing electrification to introduce the integrated approach, so that then it is not all one way fit for everybody. They should look at ways and means of breaking it down, matching demand with the available connection option, so that then, of course, the use of renewable energy in terms of the standalone and the use of the mini grids can be a pre-electrification, because, of course, not everybody wants will be supported by the use of renewable in terms of the standalone systems and the mini grid. But if it becomes a way of even introducing electricity to this particular level of customers, so that then it can grow further and it can support the utilities to really be financially sustainable in the future, rather than creating a problem by increasing access to the utilities, which, of course, have a central role to play in the government. Thank you very much.
Do we have questions for Dr. Ondiek? Yes, please identify yourself.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Cici. I am from the Technical University of Munich. And I wanted to ask about fitting the services to the customer. If we fit then for these customers of the rural households these small systems, don't you think that then we would be limiting the possible development that they could be achieved if they got really grid connection? Because from solar home systems and this really small scale, you cannot really run a pump or something so that they can develop what supposedly electricity does. Thank you.
Okay, I think what I meant is you try to match what their demands look like. If you go and if you notice that in a community there's an anchor customer. An anchor customer could be for example, a water pump, a secondary school, something that requires a bit of energy more than just the basic. Then you can think about a mini grid, so that then you can be able to optimize that particular installation. But if you provide a mini grid to customers who just use electricity for basic, you will end up using half of that capacity at the end of the day. And that is something we've noticed. We've seen it with some few installations of mini grids that have been done, in anticipation that if people are poor, if you've seen what happened, they peak so fast and arrive at, because that is what they can afford. They can afford a light, a radio, and a TV, and that's it. We don't have schemes to enable them purchase any new electrical appliance that then can utilize that particular electricity. But if it's an anchor customer, that is expected.